I think if you want rights respected by politicians, you just need better politicians. Because as we saw during COVID, what did the charter really do to protect our rights? They're not thinking charter. And I'm very much a fan of rights, but when I had some friends saying, I don't care if you're dripping with COVID, you don't have a right for the government to tell you not, like, we're not to go. Really?
Concepts with Sean Whatley.
Brianna Morris is a researcher, a consultant in government relations and public relations. Brianna has worked in senior roles at the Alberta legislature, and that includes stakeholder engagement, public policy development, communications work, and a whole bunch more. Brianna has her master's in political science from the University of Calgary, and she is the current president of Civitas Canada. Welcome, Brianna.
Hi, Sean. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
Great. I've been asking everybody, what does the word conservative mean in Canadian politics?
I would say, to me, being a conservative means I believe in small government. So a smaller role for government where civil society has more of an opportunity, as opposed to my understanding is if you go farther left on the spectrum, it's a bigger role of government with higher taxes where the government and the state does more, whether it's providing social services or publicly run institutions instead of voluntary ones. And I think as Canadians and just throughout the world, we get better outcomes through the conservative model, which is smaller government. And so, that's where my head is first. If you say in Canadian politics, and I think talking to a lot of my friends, they would equate conservatism with whoever the political leader is at the time. So a lot of people would answer whatever Pierre Poilievre stands for. But as somebody with political science background, I would take issue with that.
That is a great answer. And I think that's the shortest answer we've had yet. You must be a political scientist. You just captured it all, and that's fantastic. Maybe I'll ask you a follow-up. Everybody says the conservatives they just care about big business and lots of money, and they don't care about the little people. Have you ever heard that, or how would you respond to that?
Absolutely. So I think a lot of my friends would equate conservatism with capitalism. And now I am a capitalist, but I also think they misunderstand what capitalism is, and they'll mistake cronyism and rent seeking with capitalism, where I see it more as a free market, which we don't really have in Canada for the most part. So I've heard it. I would also point out to them, so at least like in Alberta in the last election, the most well-to-do ridings went NDP, and the lower income areas and all rural Alberta went for the UCP, the Conservative Party. And I think that's a change. Historically, my understanding is the farmers went NDP, and it was the cities that were more conservative, and it switched. And anybody who will say just conservative is equated with wealth and capitalism, I say, then why are your richest ridings in Alberta voting NDP and the working class voting UCP? So just on that point, I would take an issue with that, but I've definitely heard it. But I think it comes back again to the role of government. Your kids, they probably want to see more equality where people our age can actually buy home. And they are blaming what they understand to have been a capitalist system in Canada as the reasons they can't afford things.
Brilliant answer. No, and I think some people have labeled what you just described as a realignment, where there's a different group of voters voting for these traditional parties. And yet people still cling to these actually quite old ideas about big business and country club people. And conservatives aren't there. They're mom and dad driving a minivan with 2 kids or something. Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I wanted to jump into your master's thesis, and that was my first nerdy question. I apologize for it, but I've really enjoyed asking people that question. So you wrote your master's thesis, and I think this is the title, How the Charter of Rights and Freedoms Has Affected Political Landscape in Canada, or that's the topic anyways. Wonder if you could tell us about that. It seems like that's more relevant than ever as we hear more and more people right of center appealing to the charter. And yet when the charter came in, it was very much a left of center effort. Or have I got that wrong?
No, I think you're right. So thanks for the chance to talk about this. So I was involved in politics during this whole COVID pandemic, and I don't like a lot of what went on. And I know a lot of people that were citing a charter and saying their charter rights were violated. And I agree. But what's fascinating to me is that the charter rights came in under Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. And when you're fighting against government tyrannical behavior, you're using their own document. And so I always found that interesting. And I try to point out to people that there's rights we have that are in the charter. We don't have property right. A lot of these people also care about firearms rights. It's not in the charter. So I wonder if it's a bit misguided. And it begs the question, do you not have rights then if they're not written into the charter? So yeah, for my master's thesis, I dug into how the charter changed the nature of constitutional law in the country. So it used to be mostly the division of powers where judges would say, no, you don't have the right to do this because you don't have jurisdiction in this area. So one that comes to mind is the margarine reference. The government tried to make it a crime to sell margarine to protect the dairy industry. And I personally don't like margarine. I much prefer butter. But they could say that law was unconstitutional because you didn't actually have the jurisdiction for it. It wasn't a proper criminal law. Then when the charter came in, it changed everything, where it was like this nice new tool that judges could use and make up a whole new jurisprudence of not constitutional because it violates rights. And it's been fascinating to me to look at it, how it has affected abortion legislation, nudity bylaws. What are some other examples? Impaired driving legislation is a big part of what I looked at. But
it seems to me like the Charter of Rights and Freedoms doesn't necessarily protect your rights. So I'm thinking of conscience rights for people working in health. Does the Charter even protect our rights when we need them?
No, I see what you're saying. And there's several questions in there. The first one, does it actually protect your rights? That's a big debate. And I probably lean on the side of no, because to your point, there's the Section 1, which is you have all these rights, except as reasonably justified in a democratic society. And then it started the whole Oakes test. So is it proportional, and how much are you actually being affected by it? It's just become a legal document. It's not actually protecting your rights at the end of the day, and it's also, I'd say, put more hand in judges, and it just makes judges more political. There was the debate between judicial supremacy and parliamentary supremacy, or who should be making the decisions at the end of the day. And I guess it depends who gives you what you want, because I'll hear the same people saying, oh, no, the judge says that's unconstitutional. It's unconstitutional. It's not right. But then as soon as the judge rules in favor of whatever you dislike, then, oh, that's not right. It should be the politicians that decide. They're the ones we elected. So it really just became, what is it, your personal opinion? And then that's whether you prefer the judge ruling or the politician's ruling. And so the notwithstanding clause in the charter is also fascinating to me. It's a 5-year exemption where the government can just say, yeah, I know the court said our law is unconstitutional, but we're just going to do it anyway. And then every 5 years, I guess they just have to say, we're still not listening and we're still going to keep violating your rights. So my thesis supervisor, Dr. Rennernoff, who's brilliant, during our graduate study or my graduate studies, he would often make the case that it's misunderstood, that it should be a dialogue between the courts and government of trying to figure out, like, where's the kind of that balance? Because some people will say, if you invoke the notwithstanding clauses of the government, you've clearly violated rights and you're evil and you're horrible and you should be voted out. But it's government saying, we disagree with you and let's figure this out. And I wish more people were just aware of the politics that happen within these legal cases as well. And that it's not black and white. In fact, when you have a 2-judge versus 1-judge decision, again, the one with 2 will win, but you still have this compelling dissenting opinion. And how are judges appointed in this country? By politicians. And so I guess going back to what we said earlier, is it charter the right way of like pursuing what it is you want and what you think is right in society? Or is there some other better way to protect rights in this country than a written bill of rights that get lawyers all excited?
Do you have these kinds of discussions in your job as a consultant or in your job working inside the legislature? Or do you have a completely different mindset where you're saying, okay, we've got the public coming to us. How are we going to manage this? Or can you walk me through that process? Do you get into these nerdy academic discussions, or is it much more practical?
It's more practical. I would love to get more nerdy, and I've been in the legislature being like, hey, I wrote a thesis on that. Let's talk about it. And it's just, this is the cynic in me coming out. But no, this is what the polls show is popular. This is what's political. And this is what people want us to do. So we're just going to do it. So that's my cynical answer. But I would say constitutional cases take time. So I actually do think governments will just do policies that they think make sense, knowing it might not withstand constitutional scrutiny, but they'll just do it anyway, because by the time it works its way through the courts, it's already done. So COVID probably is an amazing example of that. I think a lot of politicians knew they're violating the charter by imposing a lot of their restrictions, but by the time it's fought in court, you've already had people stay home and it's already done its damage. And now we have cases years later, but what they wanted to have happen at the time already happened.
It seems like it's kicking the can down the road. We'll let the courts figure it out. We're going to survive to be in government another day. Hopefully this won't impact the next election. Now, is that me being too cynical?
No, that is absolutely my cynical take. In Alberta, we have currently a movement of Albertans that are trying to set up an Alberta Bill of Rights because they're upset about what happened during COVID. But again, we had a Bill of Rights before the Charter, right? Diefenbaker brought in a Bill of Rights, and then Pierre Trudeau wanted one that was within the Constitution. So I fail to see the rationale behind an Alberta Bill of Rights and what teeth is that actually going to have. I'm very sympathetic to some of the stuff that is in there, but we also don't have jurisdiction for some of the stuff I've seen people want. They want like cash to be allowed. And I, again, very sympathetic. I don't want to central bank digital currency. I like cash, but that is something within federal jurisdiction. And just having something in writing in Alberta as just a regular statute, I don't think it will have the oomph that they wanted to. So it's maybe almost like switching gears a little bit, but I think if you want rights respected by politicians, you just need better politicians. Because as we saw during COVID, what did the Charter really do to protect our rights? And the decisions were made by the politicians. So maybe if we'd had different politicians, and I don't know, because maybe they're all still responding to the same information, data, advice from the bureaucracy, so maybe it wouldn't have made any difference. But I do wonder if you had different people in power at the time, if the decisions would have been better or different.
So my sense was politicians were in survival mode. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I think so. I think they were confused and they were frightened. So I was about to go on maternity leave when COVID was starting, but at the time I was in the government, and I know from my colleagues, they didn't know what was going on. They were frightened. We didn't know, and they didn't want people to die. So if the advice you get is you stay home and more people will survive, and it's the passionate thing to do, then I give them the benefit of the doubt. Yeah, survival mode. I don't know that, like, politically versus survival mode as a society. That's also the element.
Thinking politically. Yeah. How do I keep my job?
Well, and that's where it's interesting because, like, for the UCP in Alberta during COVID, they knew politically their own base would be more upset with restrictions. So at that point, I would say they were governing more for the province. So their own base, the UCP base, were mad the restrictions went too far, and then the general public were upset they didn't go far enough. So then I am very sympathetic to, and it was Jason Kenney at the time, I'm very sympathetic to those sorts of decisions because, yeah, what if you say, oh, we are staying open, and then it does turn out to be something where 50% of the people die, and that's sitting on your shoulders, or the hospitals are overrun, and that didn't end up happening. But if that's at the time what you were worried was going to happen, then we're not giving politicians the benefit of the doubt. So I am sympathetic to what they were dealing with at the time. But that's the thing. They're thinking about lives at stake. How bad is it going to be? They're not thinking charter. And I'm very much a fan of rights. But when I had some friends saying, I don't care if you're dripping with COVID, you don't have a right for the government to tell you not, like, where not to go. Really?
So your comments about COVID are totally legitimate. I wonder whether we've put too much hope in the whole rights talk, rights regime, Charter of Rights, because as we've just said, those rights get interpreted by the judges, by government. Can we trample on this for a while and hopefully we can get away with trampling on these rights and it'll be worked out in the courts later, versus hundreds of year old approach of common law where you have precedent. As soon as the government tries to do something that goes against precedent, you can say, listen, you can't do this because of this case and that case. Now, those precedents seem to get used in arguing about charter rights, but it seems when you appeal to charter rights or the rights approach, you're already giving up the argument before you start, as opposed to saying, no, we're not talking about rights, we're talking about precedent. And there's a rule that is above you as a government person, as a politician. And you are answerable to the common law, the rule of law, which sits above you. You said you love rights, and I understand what you mean. And I also get a little nervous. Oh, maybe you're just trying to make a bunch of rights and enforce your rights on me. So what do you think about rights?
So I agree with you. And that's partly why the charter was such a monumental shift for Canada, because it stopped being about precedent. There's all these ways now that judges could just throw out old precedents because they could make it about right. So it did, in that sense, throw out common law and what was predictable, and it changed everything. And you said something at the end of your statement too that I wanted to jump on: rights imposing on others. And then that's where I was explaining to some people the difference between a negative right and a positive right, because I've seen a lot of statements, my peers, about we have a right to healthcare, right to internet. What rights do we actually have, and which ones are maybe just things that we want? So the way I've tried to explain it to people is with the concept of negative versus positive right. So a negative right is something somebody cannot do to me, or what the government cannot do to me. And a positive right is something you have to do for me. It requires government action. And now I'm trying to remember, I think it was in BC, and this is when I did my studies, so this could have changed. There could have been an appeal since that time. But it was something like the government had to obtain data. I think it was on sperm donors. So somebody wanted information about their biological history, and the government didn't keep that data. And then the court basically said they have to. But I remember it ruffled feathers in the judicial community, because now it wasn't just saying the government can't do something. It was a judge saying the government has to do this. And there's a price tag attached to some of the stuff that you have to do. And so at that point, it's again, who's running the show here then? Is it unelected judges, or is it elected representatives chosen by people? So yeah, I think we're seeing a lot now of people trying to impose rights on other people, and rights is just such a popular topic. But again, at the end of the day, what are our fundamental rights that we want to protect? And once you have positive rights, they're going to start conflicting with each other. Because if you're demanding somebody to do something else, then you're violating their agency.
And don't they also create an obligation in someone else? If you win the positive right to food or education or healthcare, that doesn't just force the courts or the state to provide that, when the state is just a fancy word for you and me. If your neighbor wins the right to X, Y, and Z, it means you have to provide in some small way to meet that positive right that they just won. Is that fair to say?
That's exactly right. Yeah. Exactly right. And I guess something else that's bothered me recently is when people don't realize that they're part of this community that is demanding, for the demand things of communities, you are part of that community. And so what are you doing? Like at a micro level, maybe for a metaphor. So like I sit on several boards with volunteers, and I'll hear, and they're very nice people, and they're not meaning that out there, but we should be doing this, and this is a better way to do it. And instead of doing this, we should do it this way. And I always want to be like, okay, but who's we? Like, you telling me to do this? You are also on this board. Maybe who's going to step up and do it? And I've nudged people that way, and then nobody steps up to the plate. If this is happening at a board level, where we should do this and all these great things, but they're not part of it, but don't you realize it's just somebody else like you that you're expecting to do it? And I think that's what's happening at the societal level, where it's, well, we need more money for education, we need more money for healthcare, and it's yes. But who's making that money? Who's doing that economic activity? That's you and me. And if it's not clicking, that is us. You're part of that. So what are you doing personally? If we all have the personal attitude of like us versus them, it's not helpful. Who's the them? You're part of the them.
Yeah, and the we, as the way you've been using it, made me think of a question that's been bugging me recently. Roger Scruton talked about the need for a pre-political we. So a pre-political group of people that are sticking together for some reason. And I've been wondering what makes that pre-political we in Canada? What makes us stick together, right?
If I understand what you're saying, then I think you need buy-in from enough of society to pursue whatever it is you're going to do. Otherwise, we're going to have a hard time convincing the government to pursue whatever it is that this client or organization wants to see. Yeah, I think what is the common denominator in what you're seeking?
It seems to me that there's actually a political advantage to not having too much stickiness, right? Have a whole bunch of different interest groups and try to keep all the different interest groups happy. And hopefully they'll all still vote for us. But they never really have to think about, what does it mean to be a Canadian? Why don't we just become the 51st state? If we aren't the 51st state, why are we still a country? Because a country seems to need some sort of stickiness other than simply geography.
I think it's a fascinating discussion. I think it's a very important one. I don't have the answers, but it is not lost on me how quickly things have shifted with Trump. So it's Canada committed genocide. Let's destroy all of our statues. Let's move forward. But we're horrible. We're racist and we're terrible. And then, okay, let's become the 51st state. Oh no, Canada is awesome. We are great. We love being Canadian. Let's stay Canadian. I see it. And see, I told you actually were happy to be Canadian, but why? And what is it that holds us together other than being not American? I think it's a really interesting question. And I can speak to a personal level some of the reasons I love Canada, but they're not what would be found in other regions. Yeah, that's a great question. And I look forward to seeing the discourse on that going forward because I don't know what the Canadian identity is, but I think we need to figure it out and lean into it and move forward and actually build things in this country and start being loud and proud.
Yeah. So I don't think we can build a country just on being not something else. I don't think that's enough to hold us together. And if we are building our identity on not being American, then what are we building it on? And it seems to me, I grew up in Thunder Bay, so right in the middle of Canada, and we didn't really have this huge love for the monarchy. If anything, we thought, oh, that's silliness, just like Toronto, right? All the problems in Canada are due to Toronto. And so now I'm living in Toronto, and I actually think the Queen Elizabeth did a really good job. I wouldn't call myself a monarchist, but I wonder whether or not there's an opportunity for Canada to find some of its stickiness there. At least I don't have an answer for it, right? And that's why I'm asking people, what holds us together?
No, I agree with you. And I have similar feelings about the monarchy. I don't consider myself really a monarchist, but I mean, I was a big fan of The Crown on Netflix.
Yeah, me too, yeah.
I don't even watch much show, but I think shows like that kind of, I suspect, open people's eyes a little bit. It's not just some random title. There's history associated with it, and there's still traditions that I think people appreciate. It's trying to find your way in the world and starting to learn your root. I think people might be starting to wake up to doing some of that. I agree that you can't have an identity based on what you're not. And I've noticed too, just in the political world, because I've been in the campaign where people campaign on something that they're not. We're not going to do what the government does. And it's negative. We're not going to do this. We're going to do this. They don't win. I've never actually seen it win. At the end of the day, in some sense, negative campaigning works, but Canadians will resoundingly vote for somebody that has a positive vision of what will they do. And even in my own life, that's what I've adopted as my approach. Instead of thinking about what can I not do, what should I not do, how can I, and I'm a Christian, like how do I not sin? It's more the verse in Philippians of whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right. Think about those things. So then it's, for me, I'm less fretting about doing something wrong and what am I not, and avoiding something bad, and just keep my eyes focused on what I actually think is good and right, true. And then it's worked quite well for me, I think. And so I wonder if there's a way to translate that at a higher scale, where instead of focusing on what we're not, just think about what is good and let's just pursue it and stop stressing about what we don't want to be or what's the negative. So what are some of those things? And it's funny though, because I would actually say a lot of what Americans think they are, it's a lot of good things, and that's probably actually what a lot of Canadians want. So what is it about America we don't want to be? Like, which part of that? I guess I'm curious. Is it military? I don't know.
Yeah. So I like the way that you've brought in the positive campaigns. As soon as you said that about politicians having a positive campaign, I thought, what do conservatives campaign on that's positive that isn't economics? It's just always economics, right? We're going to put more money in your pocket, and that's great. Everybody needs money to buy homes and food and to retire, and so I'm not anti helping people out that way or fostering a country that promotes that. However, we seem to get really gun shy about talking about anything beyond that, about building families, building culture, building institutions. You mentioned religion, so right away thought of Jordan Peterson. He's made international audiences of millions, tens of millions of people are desperately hungry to hear him talk about genocide. And I don't even think he believes any of it's true, but he sees the value in talking about myth and spirit as a tool towards bettering people's mental health. And he gets that from Carl Jung, as far as I understand. He was a big believer in myth and spirit and the need for these stories that hold us together. What sort of positive campaigns have you seen conservatives campaign on and win other than economic ones?
Oh, that's a good question. So right now I'm just thinking about Pierre Polyev, and actually it makes me, as I'm thinking out loud talking to you, I'm like, you're right. They're not really talking about what they're for. It still very much, we just don't want to be like Trudeau. And so now they might have to start saying what they're for, especially as they're going to be dealing with a new party leader that doesn't have the same, like the public's not as upset with whoever the next Liberal leader is going to be as they are with Trudeau. So I think they are going to have to start saying, what are we for? I think you're onto something with strong families, a world where you can afford to buy a house and afford to raise children. And yeah, painting that picture, that went over well in Alberta when the UCP won in 2019, replacing the NDP government. It was, I think, back to that traditional lifestyle that people wanted. They want to be able to, the economy, I think what conservatives need to help people realize is that you need a strong economy to be able to afford the social services that you want. But I think conservatives need to do a better job translating that for the public that doesn't necessarily have the economic understanding. We want a good social safety net for those that can't afford to work. We want them to have a good life, and we see value outside of just making money. And so I'm trying to, there was a book, I think it was called The Compassionate Conservative. And it was a while since I read it, but I remember when I read it, I'm like, yeah, like we actually need to talk about the social issues as conservatives too, and what we actually want, because there's a false understanding. I think going back to what we were talking about at the very beginning of our conversation is conservatives are not just for the wealthy. We want people to be able to work and succeed, but there's the social element of it and the community and the outcomes that come from a free market that are a good thing, and it gives it a chance to people to be themselves. You're not in a socialist society where the quality of outcome, because you know what, some people just have different preferences. And some people would rather not work 7 days a week and have more time to just read their library books. And it's not like they're worse off than somebody who wants to work really hard and then maybe take a fancier vacation. It's different values.
So you were talking about the broader social issues, and Bill Gardner, so our mutual friend who passed away recently, the founder of Civitas, he used to speak with he spoke with passion on many topics, but one topic in particular that he seemed to have a lot of passion about was this whole label, social conservative. He said that it seemed to really frustrate him in a really peculiar way. And just to be clear, he was not a man of faith. He was not a believer. He loved reading Thomas Aquinas, but he also loved David Hume. But this whole idea of adding the adjective social to conservative really bothered him. He said, of course, conservatives think about social issues. So do liberals, so do Democrats. Every political philosophy is concerned with social issues, but for some reason, it's caught on that you can say, oh, that's just social conservatism and we don't really need to talk about those issues. We really just need to focus on the economy. So that's Bill Gardner. But the other thought, when you mentioned about we need the economy to have healthy families, did you hear Polyev on Peterson recently? Polyev told Peterson, he said, listen, we care about housing. And it's not just because we want houses. We want people to be able to afford a house so that they can start a family. And Polyev even said, women's biological clocks are ticking or something like that, right? He actually made a reference to people needing to have babies when they're young because there's a defined window when it's possible to have babies and when it's easier to have babies. And so he came right out and said that. And I thought, wow, that's really cool to be at least seeing Polyev very gently in Canada talking about something maybe just a tiny bit beyond economics. But that's the only example that I've seen. But I think there's a real appetite in Canada to be talking about how can we promote and defend the things that we love. And it can be anything from a favorite place that we go on vacation or a favorite family tradition or your local community church or your community center or group or whatever it is. We need to get a lot better at being able to define a positive vision for why those things are good. Why do we love those things? Why should we protect them? Anyways, now I'm turning this podcast into a monologue from me. I apologize, but
No, I love it. So a couple thoughts on a social conservative thing. I think that's interesting. I think at least in Canada, where abortion is such a wedge issue, it's almost equated with being pro-life. And I think probably a decade or so ago too, as well as being anti-gay marriage. But I think most social conservatives, they're not concerned with gay marriage and it's almost exclusively about abortion and maybe even euthanasia. So I think maybe that's partly why some people take issue with it. But to your point, yeah, everybody's concerned with social issues. So the social conservative label is a bit odd. And I get frustrated too with, I'm not a social conservative, but I'm fiscally conservative. And it's just, so basically you're just saying you're okay with abortion. I'll have to take that.
yeah.
So I think maybe we can make progress, hopefully, in this country of trying to tease that out a little bit more because I'm pro-life, but I probably have called myself social conservative sometimes, but I haven't because I've seen people that also do call themselves social conservative and they are a little bit, I'm more libertarian than they are in a sense in terms of what's personal choice in your life and what the government or the state should mandate. So I'm not usually comfortable with that label because for the most part, I think the law doesn't change people's hearts. And I think it has to be, those social conservative values, if you would, are more personal, like faith values almost. But I make an exception for abortion because I think it's dealing with another person who also has rights.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, well said. I just wanted to jump in there and say the issue for me with the label, I think there's opportunity to resurrect the label perhaps and really to define it in a positive sense. These are the things that we're for. But to your point, it's really been used as a way to identify a group of people who really are all about what they're against. But even on a deeper level, the thing that worries me about some people who really are campaigners on single issues, is that they're very comfortable with using the state and the power of law. We're just going to pass a law and we're just going to send men with guns to enforce X, Y, and Z law. Even if they did that, even if they could get power, which I don't think they ever would, and they could pass a law, which I don't think they ever will, and they could send people with guns, which I don't think is ever possible. We'll imagine in an imaginary world where they could. Would it work? And I don't think it would work. So to your point, it doesn't change hearts and minds. And it's not something you can implement. It's telling your kids, I'm making a law that you can never watch videos on your phone, ever. Good luck with that, Mom and Dad. It's not going to happen. It just won't work. And so I think the frustration for me stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of how politics works.
So I agree. At the political level, so say someone used an abortion law. Depending on the law, it would possibly stay in the books because there are some abortion laws in other countries with time limits or what have you. But you have next government and it changes, or you have a judge who says it violates the charter and boom, it's not in effect anyways. I don't know. I don't know necessarily the answer at a parent level with young children. I'm still trying to figure out too what you're saying of how much of it should be just clear. No, you're not allowed to do that. I think there's some of that I need dealing with a 4-year-old. But as a general rule, as a parent, I would much prefer to uplift my child and say, I believe in you and you're going to rise to the occasion and you're going to do this stuff that's true and good and kind and compassionate and teach those positive values and just affirm them in meeting their positive potential. And I think, to your point, it's probably much more effective than like a rule-oriented, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. But I think there has to be some of the line drawn where you can't do this. And we do have some of that in Canada. And that's where I'm not, I guess I'm still wrestling between kind of the social conservative and the libertarian side of the role of government. 'Cause, like, I think we should have a law saying you can't murder others and you can't do that. But yeah, I don't know if it changes hearts and minds.
Like you, I share libertarian roots, and I blame that on being in healthcare because I just feel the government has way too much influence, regulations, oversight that makes it very hard to provide the care patients need. However, as soon as you step outside of healthcare, there are things that you inherit as being born into this country or from your family or traditions and cultures, customs, habits. Language even is something that we inherit that we have to at least acknowledge that they exist, and then they require some fostering and support. My concern for the libertarian answer of always, that wouldn't be an issue if there wasn't so much government ownership, and it wouldn't be an issue if there was more private ownership of just let people do what they want in their own private property. Okay, so your ideal is a world where everything is privately owned and there's very little government ownership. But that sounds like a utopian world. It's like the peaceful anarchist world where we'll have zero government, but we're just going to work things out together. We are stuck with having to find answers for how to behave and what's allowed and what's encouraged in the public square. And that's where these thorny issues come up. Even if we don't have laws against things, what sorts of behaviors do we encourage or do we endorse or do we turn a blind eye to? And I respect politicians. They're able to skate between those issues and avoid them all and just focus on economics. But I don't know if that's going to work much longer. Do you think we're coming very quickly to a time where politicians are going to have to actually say, well, you know what, this cultural approach is actually, this is what we encourage in Canada. And that cultural approach, we don't do that here.
I think we're going that way. And I think your comment earlier about Pierre Poilievre making reference to women's biological clocks, I don't think he could have, I don't think a politician would get away with saying that 10 years ago. And now people are like, he's right. So we might as well say it. So I do think the tides have turned and people are going to want to see more substantive statements on social issues from politicians because it's something people are caring more about. I would like to see more leadership from our representatives and from politicians of pointing out what are good things in our culture that we want to preserve and we want to promote rather than just try to keep skirting around the issues and focusing on economics, as you said.
What I blame it on is the post-war liberal consensus. The issue with liberalism is continually maximizing rights, continually maximizing a neutral proceduralism where we're not going to talk about the content of the issues. We just got to make sure that the courts work and the tax system works and the parliament works. But that presupposes a whole bunch of social fabric that I don't think exists very much anymore, or it's fraying very quickly, and people are feeling really distressed about it. And if we can't start saying, this is a way to apply some of the ideas that we've inherited to today, to our modern situation, and we could even call this a Canadian approach to life and a Canadian approach to flourishing and the pursuit of happiness. A friend of mine from Quebec, he says, what's wrong with you guys? He said, you don't defend your way of life. He said, the French, we defend our way of life and we have to fight for it and stand up for it. He said, what's wrong with English Canada? You guys don't defend anything.
No, I agree. And I think maybe I should almost not reverse what I said before, but I will say with Albertans that want to bring in this Bill of Rights. And I take issue with that in the sense that I don't think having a Bill of Rights protects those rights. But I respect that in doing that, they are trying to take a stance for what they believe in and the kind of world that they want to live in. They want to live in a world where they have all of these rights, grow your own food, have children, and this quality of life and this freedom. And so I really respect the intent behind it, which is to say, this is what we like about our part of the world, and we think it's worth defending.
So what have we not talked about in the last hour or so that you think we should be talking about? Or what questions are we not asking or we haven't asked here that we should be asking in Canada?
The cynical part of me has been saying to friends for a long time, because I was in politics, that I considered an exercise in harm reduction. And I think it's partly because of my libertarianism and those instincts where I'm like, it's not aspirational. You're not really doing good. You're just trying to make sure the government doesn't do really bad and wreck things even further. But I would love to see my mind change on that, where you can get into politics and it's not just an exercise in harm reduction, not to conflate with like drug harm reduction, but yeah, to minimize damage. And maybe if we can actually see politicians be inspirational and again inspire young people, or it's exciting to meet their politician and there's respect again for the office, where they are saying, these are our values in Canada. This is stuff worth fighting for. We love living here. We're not even going to consider, like, Canadians wouldn't even consider moving out of the country. Like, why would you? Because it's beautiful and amazing here. And I don't know how we get those people. How do we get statesmen? Do we ever have statesmen? Because maybe we glorify or romanticize the past. But I always feel like people I talk to, we don't have the Ronald Reagans and the statesmen anymore. So I don't know if it's weird memory and they were never actually statesmen and all politicians were opportunists. So it could just be that because I wasn't there for that. Or is it that like the caliber of people in our office today, there aren't inspirational and they're opportunity. And I do point out to people like politicians in Canada now, at least at like the provincial level, they're not very well paid. But you can make quite a bit more money in other sectors and you have more of a private life. What I see politicians going through now, I don't envy them. They have no private life. They take their kids to the park and they get yelled at. They don't get a pension. And so they're in it for some like other reason, but yet people still see them as opportunistic. How do we encourage statesman-like behavior in government where they're not worried necessarily just about being reelected or being liked, but they can say it like it is and really encourage what is best for society, which is these behaviors. And we want children, we want you not to be protesting and blocking critical infrastructure, and that people listen and they want to listen. It's just something I've been thinking about, because I also am not saying let's give all the politicians pay raises, because I don't necessarily feel that way either. But at the same time, if it actually made more money, would we attract better candidates?
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I don't have an answer to how much we pay politicians. A lot of people think we should cut their pay in half and really do it as a community service. Then no one would really want this job unless they wanted to do it for another reason. But that creates other problems, right? Then only the rich and wealthy could do it. You started your comments about saying that people often get into politics, at least on the right of center side of things, to slow the descent, right? To slow down the destruction of Canada with spending and high taxes and silly policies. So it's a William F. Buckley middle of the 20th century approach of standing athwart history and yelling stop. And I think that was perhaps the right thing to do. Certainly it resonated with voters in the middle of the 20th century. However, in the 21st century, I'm not sure that there's still some of that work to be done, for sure. But I've been thinking a lot about Roger Scruton's phrase that conservatism is a work of rescue. And a work of rescue is different than a work of yelling stop. A work of rescue is positive, and you're trying to actually recover and restore and maintain something that you love and that is good. So again, it has a more of a positive connotation. In that, I think, and this is something that I haven't worked out fully yet, but I've been thinking about how Canada, for the most part, I think of my relatives, they were really pioneers. They were draining swamps and trying to create some place where they could grow some crops and raise some livestock. And that pioneering mentality leads to a certain kind of political outlook, which I would say is very much more libertarian. The government's nowhere to be seen, and so why should I be very thoughtful of anything to do with politics or economics or law? And really whenever you hear someone from the government show up, they're usually making your life more difficult. They're not there to facilitate what you're trying to do to survive, right? So
Yeah.
there's that ethos when you're building a country. And that's even as recently as the 1950s, even into the 1960s. Certainly in Northern Ontario, where still it was a survival mentality. And so sometime between 1950 and now, we don't have people experiencing that anymore. And so now politically, what kind of way should we be thinking? What emphasis should we have if you're center right and you're not a Laurentian elite? So in the past, it's only been, well, you're a pioneer and you're a rugged individualist and you don't need the government, libertarian, almost anarchist, and you love capitalism too. Yeah, that makes sense in the 1950s and 60s, but I'm not sure that same attitude makes sense in the mid-2020s. And so what shift do we need in our political philosophy? And so I think that's where there's a big gap in our political thinking on the right. Is that fair to say?
It's fascinating, actually. I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying now. Like that was the right mentality to have. But once you have the foundations, you do have to grow and develop with those foundations. Yeah, if you start a business, of course, it's very different. Starting it as your one person, your founder, you have to shift and pivot if you're going to grow and compete as your business grows. Things don't stay the same forever, but at the same time, you want to respect the roots and how you started. And so how do you find that balance? Like, you want progress in conservatism, but careful and calculated and thoughtful. It's not throwing it away.
Yeah, and it's a shift in mindset. I apologize for cutting you off, but so the pioneering mentality, you didn't have time to read books. You might have a few books. You might take Sunday off and go to church with your family, but really you're working from sun up to sundown, and by sundown you were exhausted. Whereas as society develops, the workforce becomes more knowledge workers, more intellectual workers, and then you get that time to think about culture and life and beauty and truth and goodness and all of these bigger ideas. And if our whole right of center network, or a majority of our right of center network, is built around that pioneering mentality, I don't think that's enough to sustain a country in the modern world. And so we need to articulate that in the Canadian envelope without sounding European. So I think there's work there for us to do, but
I see what you're saying. I care about tradition and I like those values, but it's not the same world it was.
no.
And so how do we thoughtfully move on and keep all of our same values? We're not saying they're an issue. It's just like the approach moving forward.
Yeah, applying it to a new world.
Yeah.
It's been wonderful having you here today. Thank you so much for taking time to share your experience and your thoughts on this. I look forward to seeing what you end up doing as a consultant out in Alberta.
Thank you for that. And this has been really fun and flexing my kind of academic brain rather than just the practical admin side. It's been fun. So I thank you so much for the opportunity, Sean.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for being on. And for those of you watching, I hope you can take the opportunity to sign up and share the show. That's the only way we'll keep this going. So we'll see you again soon.